I'm Richard Porter, and this is an On the Other Side of Things Top Gear special, and maybe a bit of Grand Tour too. Yes, it's Richard here. I'm on my own for this one because Johnny is on holiday. And as we mentioned last week, because of that, I thought I would answer some questions about the Clarkson, Hammond and May Top Gear era, maybe a bit of Grand Tour as well. Lots of people have sent in questions. Thank you for that. We'll start with one from Tom. He says, I've heard Richard say he was there back in the day at the start of Top Gear. My question is, how did you find Richard Hammond and James May? Did you put an advert in the local paper, or for James a notice in a pub? Well, James wasn't there originally. He sort of was. We knew James. I'd worked with James on old Top Gear, and Jeremy knew him from sort of just being a car journalist, I think. And he was sort of in the frame for things, but then we were worried that he was too similar to Jeremy, so he was put on the back burner. And I think we'd spotted Richard on Granada Men and Motors, and I'd been involved in screen testing him for old Top Gear. And when he came for the screen test for the new format, I said to him, oh, you almost got that job. And he was like, oh, don't tell me that. Which is true, he did. I thought he should have got it, but my boss at the time, John Bentley, said that Adrian Simpson was a better choice because he was more sort of raw material and we could shape him into our presenter. Richard was already a sort of proper TV presenter at that point. But he just came down. I guess we probably contacted his agent and invited him to come for a screen test. And we just did 2 days of getting people in back to back in this big studio behind the big Renault garage on the A40 into London. And well, I won't say the names of the other people who came in, but we saw quite a lot of people. And we just had this big room with, I think, a couple of cars in it. One of them was a Renault Aventime, and we got them to walk around and talk about that. And then we had this desk, sort of Two Ronnies style, where Jeremy and whoever we were testing sat next to each other and did sort of like what became the news on the show, going through press releases and pictures of cars and just talking about them. And there were a lot of people who weren't quite sure they were right for the show, and we had all sorts, it was a kind of whole range of people come in. And Richard was one of the few people, after we'd seen him, he was driving away in his khaki old left-hand drive 911 from the 80s. And we were standing at the big scene dock door that was open, Jeremy and me, and Jeremy went, I liked him a lot. And that was sort of it. It was all very brief. I think most people were only in for not even an hour maybe. And then Jason Dorr came about because I think we did a sort of call for people to send tapes in, just if you were a member of the public and you fancied to go. And he was one of the people who sent in a tape for that, and one of the few that stood out. So we got him in. And because he was at that point, he trained car dealers. And I think he just amazed us with all this information he had about how he did his job and how he taught dealers how to sort of mirror people's breathing and body language and stuff. And we went, this is really interesting. This guy's going to bring totally different mindset to what we do because he comes from a different world. And he did a really good screen test, walking around the Avon team and stuff and talking about bits that he'd heard on the grapevine were wrong with it and things. And he sort of wowed us that way. So he got the job, and then it didn't quite work out. The BBC weren't very happy with him. They weren't very happy with Richard either. They rang him just before Christmas after the first series and went, yeah, we might not have you back next year. Anyway, Merry Christmas, bye. And gave him a thoroughly miserable Christmas that year. But then they saw sense and agreed that we could keep him. But they said, oh no, Jason, it's not quite working. So we did a few more screen tests, and then we got James back in, because I think all along we sort of knew that he would work, even if he was a bit similar to Jeremy, because actually he's not that similar to Jeremy. They have lots of different opinions. They are just sort of two middle-aged white blokes, but that's where a lot of it ends. Next question from James Markham. He says, my question is about the logistics of filming the road trip type films. There's often a breakdown along the way where one of the trio is left behind. Did they really get left behind? This seems a logistical nightmare, breaking up camera and sound crews to track the two arms of the trip. No, they really did get left behind, because we would have three crews. with 3 sound recordists and all the other sort of ancillary bits. So, I mean, certainly the latter days, to try and be a bit more organised, they'd each have a tracking car, and you'd have crew A, B and C with a big gaffer tape A, B or C on the side to make it easier to figure out where everyone was going. So if someone broke down, they had a crew that would stay with them to make sure that what was happening was getting filmed, and it liberated the others to keep on going. And that's pretty much the way it always worked. So it was never a massive wrench. And yeah, if someone broke down, I mean, there's not much you can do if a car's broken down. You just got to fix it. You can't really sort of cheat it. We didn't have like low loaders or anything to whisk the cars further along the journey. As a boring car driver out of the social medias says, does Richard have any plans to join his colleagues in pub ownership? Perhaps the pair of you could open one together. I suggest you call it the Flute and Stroker. No, not going to do that, because I know how much money James and Jeremy lose on owning pubs. I mean, I think James, he's keeping above water, but it's certainly not a passport to vast fortunes. And yeah, Jeremy, between the pub and the brewery as well, which he's still having to pour cash into to keep it going while it establishes, it's not I found out how the sauce is made there, and I don't like the sound of it, so no. Greg Dash asks, what happened to Top Gear Dog, and for that matter, why did Top Gear get a dog? Top Gear Dog was always Richard's. Why did we get a dog? Because we used to do, between series, we would gather ideally somewhere away from the office. And I think in this case, it was some swanky members club in central London. And we basically rented a room for the whole day. And we would sit and we would just go through ideas. And as often happened, Jeremy would get ahead of steam, and he would start talking about stuff that was on his mind, because he was always thinking about this. And he would kind of command the room for a while, and it would just be him going, what about this, what about this, I've thought about this, does anyone know where we can get this, and he would sort of just get everything off his chest that he'd been thinking about while we were off air. And so he'd been talking for ages, and then I think he realised he'd been talking for ages, and so he stopped, he looked around the room and he went, James, have you got any ideas? And there's a pause, and May went, I was wondering, could we get a dog? And everybody laughed, and then everybody went, yeah, dog, let's get a dog. And then we went, yeah, okay, we'll get a dog. Blue Peter had a dog, maybe still does, I don't know, but why couldn't we have a dog? It was the first idea that had been mentioned all day that everybody in the room went, yeah, definitely, let's do that. And then Hammond went, well, actually, we've been thinking of getting a new dog as a family, and we were thinking of getting a Labradoodle. So why don't we go ahead and get a puppy? I'll bring her to work, and she can be the show dog. And that's sort of how it happened. And then I think, was that the series when then Richard had his accident and other things became more important? And also having a dog on a shoot, not always totally convenient, even though she was pretty well behaved. But, if Richard had to go off in a car and do something, somebody else has got to look after the dog. And so it became sort of a little bit of a nuisance, and then we had other things on our plate, and so she just went and lived with Richard, which is what she'd always done. She died a few years ago, but she's Richard's family dog, or one of them, for quite a long time. Victor asks, of all the cars from the specials, which one would you have taken home if you had the opportunity? I don't know. I really like that Cadillac that James had in the US special, and I really like that Lotus Esprit that he had in the Patagonia special. And I don't know. They've been quite... The trouble is they always then seem to get mucked up or, broken or something. So there are a few that the presenters have adopted. I like the cars they had in the original Botswana special as well. And obviously Richard took Oliver home. But I thought the other two were quite cool as well. Matteo says, I know you and others have mentioned before in interviews that the times we saw the Top Gear studio at Dunsfold, those were the actual offices and not some joke prop building. This is true. The terrible porter cabins were the real offices at the airfield, and they were really, really manky, and deliberately so, because Andy Willman always told the airfield people not to clean them up. He thought that having grim offices focused our minds on making the show. Matteo's question is, were those offices heated or cooled? And if so, which of the three hosts was the most particular about the temperature? My girlfriend hypothesizes that James would be the most particular about the specific temperature because he'd have read a study about the optimal temperature for productivity. We also agree that Jeremy would have whined about the conditions no matter the temperature. Jeremy liked the misery, I think. He liked the grimness. He never complained about that. There wasn't like a thermostat on the wall, not that I was ever aware of. In the winter, there were some crappy heaters. And in the summer, maybe there might have been a fan if it was getting really hot. But no, I could see why you'd think James would be specific about this because he's a very specific man, but I don't ever remember him talking about the temperature. The only thing we had was in the sort of presenter's green room, which had these kind of weird like bay windows, I guess because it looked out over the airfield and maybe it was some kind of flight control place back when they made Harriers there. I'm not sure, but those bay windows just used to be full of flies all the time. And sometimes a member of production would come in and sort of half-heartedly spray a can of something around. And then one day, James developed the theory that what they had was accidentally a can of flies, and they were just introducing more flies into the room. So, no, flies were complained about. Temperature, no, don't remember them ever mentioning it, really. Another question, Rob asks, is there anything you've seen on other motoring shows that you really wish you'd come up with on Top Gear or the Grand Tour? For example, I always liked Fifth Gear's crash test features, as you discussed recently. Yeah, I liked those as well. And I think it was Fifth Gear that did a thing where they went, what if you put 4 space savers on a car? How would the handling be after that? And I remember thinking, oh, that's a really neat idea. And with hilarious consequences as well. I liked it. Johnny did a thing where he drove a Lada Niva coast to coast across Britain without using roads. And I remember being very jealous of that as a good idea. There's probably loads, actually. You know, there's only a finite number of good ideas, I reckon. And sometimes you would watch stuff and go, oh. I think Driven's do the thing where they were knobbing around with plastic trays under the back wheels of front-wheel drive cars. And again, you just went, that's a good bit of knobbing around. That wish we'd done it first. And then we sort of did it again on a Grand Tour thing with cutting up a plastic bin around the back wheels. Moving on, Adam asks, whatever happened to the restoration that Top Gear did a poll on? They never updated us about it. God, this was really sort of early days. It was called Restoration Ripoff, that feature, which doesn't make any sense now. But at the time, the BBC was doing a show called Restoration, where the public voted for a building that they thought should be restored out of a short list of contenders. And we went, oh, let's just rip that off. But then, because it's obvious what we're doing, we'll confront that and we'll call this feature Restoration Ripoff. And I can't remember all the cars that were in it. There was a thing called an Adams Probe, which I think had been used in the movie Clockwork Orange. That was quite interesting. But the winner was an ex-Paddy Hopkirk competition Mini. And I think the deal was that, like, we didn't buy the car. These were punters' cars that they'd submitted for this contest. And then the winner, we would pay or part pay for the restoration of the car. And it's a long time ago, but from memory, the car was restored, and I guess we threw in cash for that. And we were supposed to go and film it while it was being restored, and then that got postponed. And in the interim, the Mini community got a bit bristly about the provenance of that car and whether it was legitimately what it claimed to be. And it was all getting a bit bickery, as one-make car worlds sometimes do. And I think we got a bit scared off. And so the car was restored. And as far as I know, it was completed and it was all looking very spanky. But people were claiming, it had been reshelled and all this sort of stuff, which I guess happens a lot in the old Mini world, like it does in the old Land Rover world. So that may have scared us off, or we just simply forgot to mention it, because quite honestly, those were the days when we were making, I think, 2 series a year still. Maybe even when we were making 2 series of 10 shows, so it was 20 shows a year. It was quite intense. and things just fell by the wayside because we were so busy trying to keep afloat. And so it's quite possible there wasn't, it's nothing nefarious. It was just that we forgot. Right. Question from a listener called Magic, although it's not spelt like that. You have said it's pronounced Magic, so I'm going with that. And they say, you've mentioned a couple of times that you wrote for Top Gear USA. This was a surprise as you didn't mention it in your Top Gear book. When I lived in the States, the show was regularly on, and personally I thought it got better and better with each series as the show moved away from the Top Gear UK format and became more of its own thing. That was the Tanner, Rutledge and Adam era one, which I guess, have I mentioned this? But it started off, they'd bought the format, and the format is you have these films interspersed with bits in the studio. And it was shown for some reason on the History Channel. And there was one of the things that they research everything. And one of their bits of research after the first series were that American audiences didn't understand the jump between the pre-recorded bits, the VTs as we call them, and the studio, because there was no real precedent for that in US TV. I think we're probably sort of used to it, from a young age, because things like Blue Peter, the presenter would go. Anyway, I went and had a look at Lichfield Cathedral, and then it would be the same person in different clothes out in the field. American TV doesn't really work like that, so they were a bit like, why is that guy suddenly time travelled to a different place and wearing a different shirt? So it was one of the things they were keen to drop, and eventually the studio was dropped. In fact, quite quickly the studios dropped from Top Gear US, and probably for the better, because they had ad breaks as well, and it really chopped it up, kind of spoilt the flow of everything that we got from being on the Beeb in the UK and not having adverts. Anyway, Magic asks, I was wondering if you could talk about how you got involved in the show and what it was like writing for it, considering how different Tanner, Rutledge and Adam were to the UK trio. What were the challenges in script writing for a show aimed at the US public? I got involved in the show because I was just asked to sort of be a consultant on it, because I did the UK show, and BBC Worldwide, the commercial department as it was called back then, they wanted to keep an eye on things, make sure that the American production people weren't just going nuts and breaking away from the format. So I didn't write loads. I used to go over or just work remotely, going through ideas and saying, hey, why don't you do this instead of that? And we've tried this and it didn't work, so why don't you not do that, because I promise you it'll be shit. And that was sort of how it worked. And but when I did write, I wrote a load of the first studio, which in retrospect I was trying to write it like I'd write for the UK 3 and make them bicker all the time. And actually I think Adam, Rutledge and Tanner, they didn't have so much that relationship, and they sort of just got on more smoothly. They were really, really good to work with, by the way. Very nice guys. And what's quite sweet is one of the reasons that show got better is because they became friends. They didn't know each other when the show started, but they became friends and are still friends to this day, which I think is quite brilliant. Even though they're not on telly together, they're just mates. And it sort of shows when you watch the later ones, they have that easy kind of back and forth of people who know each other and who get on and like each other. So no, and there weren't really challenges when I did do scripts. There weren't really challenges because there were lots of Americans who could check my homework and go, yeah, we know to say that word, or that sounds weird. And so it was more challenging when quite early in the life of Top Gear UK, the BBC said, we're selling the show to, I can't remember which American network, as a sort of clip show essentially, or we're recompiling all of the different elements, so not in the order that you showed them, because the shows have to be shorter. And someone in our office almost went to the brink of madness with spreadsheets, trying to find different films of ours that would add up, because the shows had to be a very specific length, like 42 minutes or something, for a US broadcast with ad breaks. And then we recorded new links down at the studio. We just spent like 2 or 3 days down at Dunsfold recording these new links, and they said, can you try to use American words for things? And sometimes we were in the middle of it and we'd go, wait a second, that's not the American word, but what is? And I had a friend who was American at that point. And I remember from the studio floor in front of a small audience having to ring my friend Amber and go, hey, quick one for you. What would you say for radiator? Is it the same word or not? We can't remember. And then we sort of did it on the fly. And sometimes the person with the stopwatch would come up and go, yeah, we've added it all up. And actually, this show's only coming in at 41 minutes. Could you make that link longer? And we'd have to think of some bullshit to say on the fly. But that was for I don't know where those shows went, whichever network bought them and put them out. But it was the early days before Americans really noticed Top Gear, so they probably sank without trace. Michael Gardner asks, what is the segment or moment you'd like to redo in modern times, or because you weren't happy with the final production of it? I've said quite a few times I didn't like the India special, and I think part of the problem with it is it just didn't really have enough of a point. It had this vague idea that they're on a trade mission to sell British products, and it just didn't make sense. The reason was we really wanted to go to India because it's an amazing place, and then we had to reverse engineer a reason. And if we couldn't find, or we decided not to find an A to B journey, so they just meandered about being stupid, and it annoyed me, and I never liked that. And I would love to do it again, as in go to India again, just because I think we could do better. But so that's sort of one I'd like to redo because I wasn't happy with it. Redoing one in modern times, like the £100 cars, I don't know if you could do that anymore, but I suppose allow for inflation. Could you do it in £200 or £300 cars? Just to see, because it was sort of interesting, and it was almost kind of consumer advice, because I think the original premise of that film was, can you get a car for less than a train ticket to Manchester and back? And then they drove to Manchester and back, and that was sort of the premise. Fairly low ambition, but it was an interesting film because it was like, oh, shit, you can get a car for less than £100. And actually back then as well, what was quite nice about it was like Richard and James genuinely just sourced their own cars and went and picked them up because they weren't that famous and they could do that. And Jeremy was more famous, but his wife found that Volvo that he had in their local Volvo dealership when she was taking their XC90 for a service. So I'd like to do that. 10 grand supercars, I mean, you just couldn't do that anymore. There aren't any 10 grand supercars. Even really khaki ones are worth a lot more. So there was £1,500 Porsches, I think it was. You could sort of have a stab at that, but I suppose they'd all end up with Boxsters, but that might not be a bad thing. As Johnny has proved, you can get a Boxster for under 2 grand. So if we up the budget a little bit, I reckon that would be quite interesting. And again, I think that film sort of worked. And in those early days, we were always sort of trying to do things that would make people in pubs afterwards go, did you know you can buy a Porsche for £1,500? So that still might be a bit of take home there. Leo Dean says, has anyone ever released the bad pilot episodes you mention in your book? You said James May had never seen them. Is that still true? No one's ever released them. I don't even know where they are. I think I know someone who might have them on VHS, but then probably doesn't have a VHS player because, who does? And James, I doubt James has seen them. I'll ask him. But no, I can't imagine there's a circumstance where he would. And amazingly, because so few people were allowed to see them because they were so terrible, they've never sort of leaked out onto YouTube. I would quite like to see them now, just to remind myself of how bad they were. Maybe they're not. Maybe actually they were okay and you can sort of see where it was going. But I have a feeling they were not brilliant, and they should never see the light of day. And says, Rich, feel free to talk about behind the scenes on the Ground Force special. I know you've touched on it before, but in my opinion, it was absolutely flipping hilarious, and others may not know about it. The look on the guy's face when he got home was priceless. This was the Sport Relief special that we made. We used to get asked every year for Sport Relief and Comic Relief. There was a period when we were sort of successful enough to be worth asking if we would pitch in on BBC charity things. And I think there was this tradition of shows merging together. I can't remember what those would have been, but they said, what show would you like to merge with? I think it was Jeremy went, Ground Force. Let's do over someone's garden. And the Sport Relief people went, well, Sir Steve Redgrave's family have agreed to take part. And we were like, well, that's excellent. And so we did, and it was all genuine. We went up there, we hid crack of dawn, for some reason I drove that 7.5 ton lorry that we used on camera up to the location, met up with the presenters and the crew in a lay-by before dawn, and his family had sort of conspired to set this all up, knowing he was going to London for meetings but be back later. And then we did over his garden really badly, and when he came back he was genuinely very cross. We were told only while we were filming by his wife. She went, "Oh, he hates surprises. When I set him up for This Is Your Life, he didn't speak to me for a week afterwards." We were like, "Why have you done this then?" And yeah, he was genuinely quite cross when he got back. And we were still, after we wrapped filming, he was still quite cross. I think Andy Wilman gave him some actual cash money to take his family out for dinner while we cleared up a bit. But yeah, I rewatched that not that long ago because it's on YouTube, and it is all right, actually. I mean, I remember it just being dicking around from start to finish, and it is, but it's got some quite good bits in it. The brass band music gag, I think, was one of mine. I like that. And then it's got, because with those charity films, you always have to do a link into the sort of very serious charity film to raise more money. And we'd always get Richard to do them because he was the best at doing the sincere voice that you need for those. But Jeremy had a shotgun for some reason on that, and James kept measuring stuff very precisely. And then Jeremy took his shotgun and took measures into his own hands. And then we had to go to Richard to cue up the charity film. And he went, "And now here's a reminder of why Jeremy just shot a tape measure." And I still think it's the greatest intro to a charity film that's ever been seen on the BBC. Right, we should probably start to wrap this up because I've been going on a bit, but I'll do a couple more questions. Tom Gregory has one. He says, "Who first found the 'I went on the internet and I found this' photo, and how did they broach the subject of including it in the show?" This was ages ago in the studio, in the news, wasn't it? Jeremy would go, "I went on the internet, I found this." Tom knows it was a picture of a Range Rover with a gentleman doing something to it. So he must have been in the studio, I think, because we never showed it on the telly. That was all Jeremy. And it was his. I'm sure he found the photo. And I don't know where. And I never thought to ask at the time. It was just too strange. But I'm pretty sure he said, "I want to do this gag and show a really weird photo just for the audience to get their reaction." And when we did it, it went down so well that he did it again and again. One last question. Richard Sanderson, as one of our patrons, he says, "Back in the day, were there ever any ideas for the show that were so good and nearly got approved but turned down due to politics, cost or logistics? If so, what were they, and which ones do you wish had been approved?" There was a mad idea to do a F1 pit stop while skydiving, and I think that got nixed because of money. It would have been incredibly expensive to figure out and do, and I presume quite dangerous as well. The one that I remember Jeremy, in those days when we used to do, what's the fastest religion? Who's the fastest politician? All this stuff. You know, we had this grand idea that motorsport solved all arguments. And Jeremy said, "Let's do Britain's fastest policeman." You know, the police are supposed to be good at driving, if they're, pursuit drivers, whatever. Let's find from all the different police forces Britain's fastest police officer. And we went, yeah, that would fit with the format. Yeah, that's a good one. He went, "Yeah, but here's the thing. What I want them to do is they're all doing their laps in this car that we've got. And then at the end, we revealed that it's actually a stolen car. And they've all just been driving a stolen car." And we went, "Oh, yeah, that's good mischief." And then when we started digging into it and bringing in the lawyers and stuff, they went, "Well, wait a sec. Where are you getting a stolen car from? Are you stealing it yourselves, or are you just getting someone else to..." Either way, you cannot do this. And you cannot knowingly have a stolen car, even if it's a prank on members of the police. That's just not going to work. And so that was one of those moments when some grown-ups were quite stern with us, and we went, "Okay, yeah, no, fair enough. We won't do that then, okay." Right, thank you ever so much for all the questions. Sorry I couldn't answer all of them, but I think I've gone on more than long enough. Back to normal OTOSOT business next week. At some point in the future, Johnny will do one of these on his own, answering questions about max power, or maybe about fifth gear, or maybe both. So we'll warn you when that's going to happen, and you can send in questions. But for now, goodbye.